Lynette had always believed that anger was her most reliable currency in Fairmont Crest, the one thing nobody could confiscate from her, because it lived inside her bones and answered only to her. She had learned over years of being underestimated and politely sidelined that rage could be shaped into discipline, that humiliation could be sharpened into ambition. Yet the moment the truth surfaced, unavoidable, documented, and impossibly intimate, her anger did not feel like a weapon anymore. It felt like a fire that had started in a room with no doors. The evidence arrived like an accident that refused to stay accidental. A sealed medical report left on the wrong desk, a chain of custody form that should have been shredded, and then the final weight that crushed every remaining denial, the biological link that turned Peaches from a symbol into a sentence. Peaches was her mother, not a metaphorical mother, not a woman who had raised her from a distance with invisible hands, but the person whose blood had been inside Lynette long before Lynette ever had a choice about the shape of her life. The revelation did not give her the comfort of origins. It robbed her of the story she had built to survive, replacing it with a brutal question that kept detonating in her mind. If Peaches was her mother, then what else had been manufactured around Lynette without her consent? The rage came first because rage was easier than grief. Rage did not require vulnerability, and vulnerability was the thing Fairmont Crest devoured. Lynette's hands shook with the urge to smash something expensive, to ruin something polished, to leave a visible crack in the world that had always demanded she remained composed. But the moment she tried to turn that fury outward, it folded back in on itself, trapping her inside a cage made of thought. She could not simply hate Peaches as a stranger. Hate requires distance. This was different. This was contamination. This was the sickening realization that some of Lynette's instincts, her distrust, her appetite for control, her talent for reading rooms and anticipating betrayal, might not have been learned at all. They might have been inherited. And that possibility poisoned her with a new kind of disgust, the fear that she was carrying Peaches in her very nature, that every time she chose the sharpest response, she was proving the bloodline rather than escaping it. Peaches, meanwhile, had built her life around appearing untouchable. She carried herself like a woman who had already survived the worst, and therefore no longer owed anyone an explanation. In Fairmont Crest, she wore her past like a designer label, ambiguous, alluring, and deliberately expensive. People whispered about her schemes, her sudden rises and carefully staged falls, the way she could charm an enemy into lowering their guard and then leave them bleeding politely behind closed doors. She had always been a problem that never stayed solved, a presence that carried the quiet threat of unfinished business. Now, with the truth exposed, her image shifted in an instant. She was no longer simply dangerous. She was responsible. And responsibility was the one thing Peaches feared more than any scandal, because responsibility meant accountability, and accountability meant losing control over the narrative she had spent years carefully laundering. The first real rupture happened when Lynette began to replay every interaction she had ever had with Peaches, like a detective forced to reinterpret a case after discovering the prime suspect was family. The memories changed shape. Innocent coincidences began to look like choreography. That one time Peaches had appeared at an event Lynette thought was private, the way she had watched Lynette from across the room as if studying her reactions, the subtle information Peaches had accidentally dropped into conversation that pushed Lynette toward a specific choice. None of it felt random anymore. Lynette realized that the most terrifying part of the truth was not that Peaches had given birth to her. It was the possibility that Peaches had been shaping her, again, now in adulthood, like a sculptor returning to a work she had abandoned and decided to finish. Lynette's fury needed a target, and that target quickly became the silence itself. There were only two ways this could be real. Either Peaches had known all along and said nothing, or Peaches had discovered the truth recently and still said nothing. Either option was unforgivable, because the silence was not neutral. Silence was strategy. Silence was a blade. It meant Peaches had watched Lynette build her identity on missing pieces and never offered the missing parts, because keeping Lynette incomplete was useful. It meant Lynette's loneliness had been an asset in someone else's long game. And then Lynette found the second layer, the one that made her stomach turn colder than rage ever could.
There were signs of tampering, small bureaucratic scars on documents, dates that didn't align, signatures that looked too carefully replicated. The story of Lynette's beginnings had not merely been hidden, it had been edited. Someone had ensured she would grow up without the correct name on the correct paper. Someone had erased a trail with the precision of a professional. Lynette could not decide which was worse. The idea that Peaches had done it herself, rewriting her own past like a thief, or the idea that Peaches had let someone else do it and accepted the bargain because it benefited her. The betrayal expanded beyond mother and daughter into a wider conspiracy, the kind Fairmont Crest specialized in. Power protecting itself through paperwork, love weaponized through omission, family reshaped into a tool. Lynette's decisions began to split her in two. Part of her wanted to confront Peaches immediately, to force the truth out in the harshest way possible, to corner her and make her bleed answers. That part of Lynette imagined justice as humiliation. She imagined dragging Peaches into the kind of public exposure Peaches had always avoided, tearing away the glamour and letting people see the rot. But another part of Lynette, sharper, more calculating, and more frightening, saw opportunity. If Peaches had kept the secret, then Peaches had a reason. And if Peaches had a reason, then Lynette could use it. Lynette could become the one person capable of destroying Peaches without lifting a finger, simply by revealing what Peaches had tried to bury. In Fairmont Crest, the right information was worth more than love. Lynette had just been handed the most valuable currency of all, the true origin story that could reframe every relationship Peaches had built. Yet that plan required Lynette to do something she despised, become strategic with her pain. It required her to sit with the knowledge and not explode, to let anger mature into something colder. That restraint felt like betrayal of herself. She had survived by being honest about her fury, by making her emotions too large to be dismissed. Now she was considering turning those emotions into a silent weapon, the very technique Peaches seemed to embody. Lynette could feel her own identity wobbling. If she played this like a chess match, was she proving she was Peaches' daughter in the worst way? If she chose immediate confrontation, was she sabotaging her own power out of desperation for relief? Peaches, for her part, sensed the shift long before Lynette made a move. She had survived too long not to recognize the temperature change in a room, the way people stopped looking directly at her, the way conversations stuttered and then moved elsewhere, the way her name acquired a different weight in other people's mouths. These were the early signs of a storm. Fairmont Crest did not forgive women for complicated motherhood. It romanticized sacrifice and punished survival. Peaches had built herself into a symbol precisely because symbols did not have to answer personal questions. Now she was being dragged into the most personal category of all, and she could not charm her way out of biology. What made it worse was that Peaches had never seen herself as someone who abandoned a child out of cruelty. In her own mind, she had abandoned Lynette out of necessity, out of an instinct to protect her from something larger, something ugly enough that it could swallow them both. She had told herself that the distance was love. She had told herself that the erasure was mercy. She had told herself that if Lynette grew up not knowing, Lynette could remain untouched by the violence that had shaped Peaches' earlier life. But those justifications were beginning to crack under pressure, because the truth was now visible, and a justification was not the same thing as forgiveness. Peaches could feel the old fear crawling back, the fear that she had miscalculated, that her so-called protection had actually been control, that she had built her daughter's life on a lie because it was easier for Peaches than facing the consequences of being a mother. Lynette's obsession deepened into something dangerous when she began to investigate the people around Peaches. She didn't just want to punish Peaches, she wanted to understand the machine that had made this secrecy possible. She traced timelines, watched who visited Peaches and when, and paid attention to which names appeared repeatedly in the shadowy margins of Peaches' life. The more Lynette uncovered, the more she understood that Peaches had never moved alone. There had always been someone smoothing the path, cleaning up messes, rewriting outcomes. It was not simply that Lynette had been hidden, Lynette had been placed, and placement implied intention. Placement implied that Lynette had been positioned as a piece on a board, even as a child, without knowing the rules of the game she was in.
That realization was the moment Lynette truly hit the wall. It wasn't just betrayal anymore, it was theft. Someone had stolen her ability to choose who she was by denying her the facts. Someone had stolen her ability to decide what family meant. And if Peaches had been involved in that theft, then Lynette was not merely a daughter confronting a mother. She was a victim confronting an architect. The pressure forced Lynette into a series of decisions that felt like self-harm disguised as strategy. She began to isolate herself from people who cared about her because care felt suspicious now. She stopped trusting kindness, convinced it was another form of manipulation. In public spaces, she wore calm like armor, but it was the kind of calm that made others uncomfortable because it looked like the silence before a collapse. Every time she saw Peaches across her room, Lynette felt the pull of two opposite instincts, the ache to be recognized as a daughter and the hunger to be recognized as a threat. She hated herself for that ache. She hated Peaches for making the ache exist at all. Peaches, cornered by the shifting tides, made her own harsh choice. Instead of collapsing into confession, she leaned into control. She tried to contain the damage by tightening her grip on the narrative, by ensuring the truth did not spread beyond what she could manage. But Fairmont Crest was not a place where truth stayed contained. It was a place where truth became a currency traded at parties, in boardrooms, in bedrooms, and in the quiet moments when enemies pretended to be friends. The more Peaches attempted to hold the story, the more she revealed how desperate she was, and desperation in Fairmont Crest was a scent predators could detect instantly. The conflict became a trap with no clean exit. If Lynette exposed Peaches publicly, she risked being seen as vindictive, opportunistic, or unstable, exactly the labels powerful circles used to dismiss women who told uncomfortable truths. She risked the possibility that the world would sympathize with Peaches and shame Lynette for not being grateful for whatever protection Peaches claimed she had provided. If Lynette stayed silent, she risked becoming complicit in her own erasure. If she confronted Peaches privately, she risked being manipulated again, risked hearing a story so carefully crafted that it would rewire her anger into doubt and leave her weaker.
And in the middle of all that was the most brutal decision of all, whether Lynette wanted a mother or whether she wanted justice. Those desires were not compatible in Fairmont Crest, where forgiveness often became a leash. As Lynette's internal war escalated, so did the external stakes. Subtle attacks began, pieces of information leaking at just the right time, people approaching Lynette with rehearsed concern, invitations to private conversations that felt like ambushes designed to measure her silence. Someone was trying to manage Lynette, someone besides Peaches. That became Lynette's clearest proof that the secret was bigger than a single woman's shame. A larger system had invested in keeping Lynette in the dark, and now it was investing in keeping her controlled. The worst night came when Lynette realized she could no longer separate her personal trauma from the political machinery around her. She understood with a sick kind of clarity that her birth was not merely a personal story. It was leverage. It could destroy reputations, unravel alliances, expose crimes, and reassign power. That meant the truth had value to people who did not care about Lynette as a person. They cared about Lynette as a detonator. And Peaches, whether out of love, fear, or selfishness, had kept Lynette close enough to be useful, but far enough to remain obedient. Lynette's anger reached its purest form then, not loud or explosive, but precise and violent in its focus. She began to picture how she could turn the trap into a weapon. She could force Peaches into a choice where every option was loss. She could make Peaches decide between protecting her own empire and acknowledging her daughter. She could make Peaches either confess and ruin herself or deny and prove her cruelty. Lynette understood that the power she had been denied was now within her grasp, but taking it meant stepping into the same darkness she accused Peaches of living in. Peaches, sensing the cliff edge, faced her own internal collapse. Beneath her composed exterior, a different terror grew. The terror that Lynette would not simply expose her, but would become her. That the daughter she had tried to keep clean would become ruthless, and that Peaches would have no one to blame but herself. The tragedy was that Peaches had always feared Lynette getting pulled into the worst parts of her world, and now her secrecy had practically guaranteed it.
By trying to control the narrative, Peaches had created the very monster she claimed to be preventing. By the time both women understood the full shape of the crisis, they were already trapped in its momentum. Lynette could not unlearn the truth. Peaches could not undo the years of silence. Fairmont Crest, hungry for scandal, began to circle. The community did what it always did. It pretended to care while sharpening its appetite. And in that tightening circle, Lynette stood at the edge of a choice that would define her entire future. Whether to break herself open for the possibility of a mother's love, or to burn everything down and claim power through destruction, even if it meant confirming the darkest suspicion she had about her own blood. In that moment, the most shocking truth was not that Peaches was her mother, but that Lynette could feel herself enjoying the idea of making Peaches pay, and the enjoyment tasted terrifyingly like inheritance.